Thank you, Mr. Mark, for your input, and can put on the discussion for the audience. Please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you for this fruitful.
Your name.
And my second question is writing this down while we're talking.
We can't hear.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
No, I can't hear.
No, it's okay.
And will the world witness one day an equal price of all these energy sources? Will any of these dominate or monopolize the market? What's your view about that? Thank you.
So your first question was about policy, and you asked what should producers and consumers do on a policy front. And I guess I'm just in regard to what policy issues are you asking that what should
General policy.
Wow. Countries, every country is its own sovereign entity and has its own set of issues that it's trying to manage. And I wouldn't presume to suggest what kind of policies producers and consumers should adopt. Assume what they do today, because those are the sources of energy that are competitive. And so, I think it's important for us as companies and governments around the world to work together to, on the supply side, to formulate competitive offers. I think there's certainly a good case to be made for more concerted action on climate change. I'm not a climate scientist, but I think BP has been pretty clear for many years that we believe that climate change is a challenge. It's a classic economic externality because the social cost of that activity is not reflected in the price of it. So to me, that seems like it's an important policy challenge for the world. But as we've seen through the recession, there are lots of important policy challenges, whether they be energy security, creating jobs in our respective economies, and that's the important role for governments to take in working with their people to sort their policy priorities. And your second question, I'm sorry, remind me, it was what will fuels prices and how do fuels compete prices? Our data is very clear that fuels do compete. We saw it very clearly in the power sector. Does that mean there'll be one price for energy around the world? Probably not. I mean, there's niche applications and frictions, and efficiencies are different for different applications. So for right now, oil is expensive, and oil has become increasingly concentrated in a place where it's hard to find competition. Transportation. Where oil faces competition in, power generation, residential heating in North America or Northern Europe, for example, oil lost that competition 40 years ago. But at the same time, we do see that fuels compete very intensively. For example, in North America, as the price of natural gas fell with the shale revolution, people stopped looking for gas and started looking for oil. We saw a very sharp shift in the way people looked for, what fuel people were exploring for. But it doesn't mean that the prices necessarily have to all be completely equal, depending on how the technologies get applied. And then other factors like carbon price, for example, that could play into the relative competition. And then the other key uncertainties, of course, are the pace of technological innovation. If a technology breakthrough happened that could get something other than oil into your car, breakthrough in battery technology, for example, you'd see more pressure to compete between fuels there. And policy, of course, has the same opportunity. Policy decisions can also drive the competitive stance of these different fuels.
For your second, I think, visit to Korea, and I hope we'll see more of it. And thank you very much for your presentation, and I think BP Energy Outlook is something that it's like a Bible for the whole industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Actually, I have three questions. My first question is whether BP invest in title and whether you have any current production or investment. My second question is, in your calculation, and you estimated that at the end of 2035, again, conventional oil or conventional energy will play a role, and then you do not see, or BP doesn't see, countries like China, Russia, Argentina investing in tight oil. If that is the case, in your study, in your outlook, what price have you taken for shale oil, to break even, whether it's 50, the 60, the 70? And my last question is, what the BP think of the current OPEC policy of not reducing production? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So, our North American onshore production unit has has production operations in both shale gas and tight oil. In fact, just on January 1st of this year, BP actually took that business unit and created its own separate company. It has a different headquarters building than the BP offices in Houston. And the reason why we did that is because this is such a ruthless, competitive industry that it's hard for a big company with corporate headquarters and an economics team to compete. And so we're trying to create a different business model to see if we can find a way. So it's not enough that it's a great resource. You have to find a way that you can compete in it. And this is a massively competitive domestic industry. So,
are you alone in the tight oil investment, or with other groups?
Well, certainly there are hundreds of companies in the United States that are investing in tight oil, and we've seen the implications of that for the rapid growth of U.S. production. Your second question was,
asking if we had partners.
I'm sorry?
He's asking if we had partners in the tight oil.
Do we have partners?
Yeah. Or it's just pure BP?
It varies by where we hold the acreage. In some plays we have partners, and some we're the sole operator. So it really depends where in the country we're.
May I ask what volume you have in produce?
I'd have to look that up. It's between oil and gas, our onshore production in the United States. I'd have to look. I think it's easily the equivalent of several 100,000 barrels a day of oil and gas combined. But I'd have to check the specific number. Next, you asked why the sense that we have limited production of tight oil in China and Russia, and why, and what's the There's actually two questions in there, so you snuck 4 questions in. First, it's almost unfair to compare our expectations for shale production around the world with the United States, because they're big numbers, except in the context of comparing them to the United States. So, for example, let me show you go back to the chart on tight oil production. We have tight oil production growth outside the United States of 2 million barrels a day. That's, one of the 15, the equivalent to one of the 10 or 15 biggest oil producers in the world. It's a huge number, except it's not huge when you compare it to what happened in the United States. So, by any normal reference point, we have a significant contribution from shale. And by the way, similarly for natural gas. So we do have significant contributions, and it's easy for us to lose perspective by looking at what happened in the United States. But behind that, we talked about some of the reasons why we think it's likely to be less aggressive outside the United States than inside. On the question of cost, that's actually more tricky than a lot of people realize. And the reason why is because the oil market is not a normal market. In a normal market, the price is set by the marginal cost of the supply, and the high cost supplier sets the price. That does not describe the oil market. The oil market, for a variety of reasons, including the existence of OPEC, has a relationship between costs and prices that is the exact opposite of a normal competitive market. In a normal competitive market, something happens to shock the cost, and then the price changes. We can demonstrate through our research that in the oil market, something happens to shock the price, and then costs adjust. So what it means is, all of this analysis about what the break-even cost is of any project, LNG, deep water, oil sands, shale, depends on what the price environment is that you're working in at the moment. And I can give you a personal example. When I joined BP in 2001, our planning assumption was $16 a barrel, and we were building, we were developing oil fields in the Gulf of Mexico and in Azerbaijan and in the Canadian oil sands. $16 a barrel. What's changed? You sure couldn't do those projects for $16 a barrel today. The rigs cost more, the seismic costs more, the tax regime costs more, the engineers cost more. I wish the economists cost more. So it means that it's actually very hard to pin down what the cost of supply is, because the cost of supply is going to change depending on what the price is. Now, in today's market, what it means is, watch out for people who are saying, oh, shale costs $80, shale costs $90, shale costs $70. Guess what? We're already hearing lots of stories. Not only are people laying off workers and cutting down their rigs, they're cutting costs ferociously. That must be happening here in Kuwait as well. I know BP is, we're working with our suppliers around the world to say, guys, what are we going to do to keep working here? And we have to work on driving costs out of the system. So this analysis that I've shared with you suggests that there is significant scope for cutting costs in the industry. And that in turn suggests that all the people who said, oh, shale costs $90, or shale costs $80, and that might be disappointing. And your final question is, what does BP think of OPEC policy? And the answer is, I think OPEC can do whatever it wants. They're sovereign states, and they play by sovereign rules.
I meant the last meeting, and not reducing production.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty clear that the oil market has become significantly oversupplied. Global production is more than global consumption. Contributing factors to that include OPEC's decision to keep prices, keep production, but also the rapid growth of U.S. oil production, the temporary recovery of production in Libya last year, growth in Iraq, weak demand growth, especially in emerging economies. All of these things, enter into the mix. So, we've already started to, we keep changing our forecast to track, how will supply and demand respond to lower prices. Assuming OPEC maintains its policy, it looks to us like the oil market is still oversupplied, even after we raise our demand forecast and even after we cut our forecast for U.S. production growth. So, we think that, if OPEC maintains its policy, it could take several years to work through this, low price patch that we're in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
My name is Ibrahim Bozan. I'm from Silent Group Holding. Question is, nowadays, companies such as BD and the other giants, what are the elements or factors that they are monitoring daily in order for them to sustain their existence?
Wow, it's an important question, and I guess part of the answer is we try to think about ourselves in one way. What we provide is energy for light and heat and mobility, and the reality is that right now, that's 85% of that is fossil fuels in the world. things change, but they change slowly in the energy industry. And so, we continue to find and work with our government host to produce oil and gas. At the same time, we have significant investments in wind, biofuels. A few years ago, we were one of the biggest producers of solar panels in the world. But as I mentioned with the shale, it's not enough if something is big. You have to be able to compete into it. And it turns out that solar panel manufacturing is not something that plays to the corporate strengths of BP. And so, we exited that business. So we're constantly watching and investing and doing studies like this to try to understand where the world is going. And in the meanwhile, continuing to do what we're good at and that provides the services that our customers want.
One more question. Would the policy of oil companies stood against any threat from any source, by renewable energy resources, by buying from freezing or just to maintain the existence type of energy production that the world is using now?
Yeah, well, BP's history in that regard. BP was actually the first major international company to come out in favor of more aggressive action to deal with climate. And this was in the mid-1990s. So, BP has had this policy for 20 years of saying, more needs to be done. But, as a company, we play on the playing field that's given to us by governments. And so, we have opinions and we share our opinions, but at the end of the day, it's not our job to make policy. And so, we live in the world that's given to us by the people who hold our license to operate.
Sorry, my name is Ayushel. I want to know about the fossil fuel. We saw for the natural oil, we saw the the plants, how the operation, So, but for these fossil fuels, we didn't see anything. They don't show us their, facilities, how they produce it, how they, sell it, and just we hear it from the media that it will compete the natural oil and gas. Not fossil, shell oil. Shell oil. Sorry. You don't think that's part of this work, this propaganda, taking other fields from, the market? We will, it is for us to lose the market and just gain it and get the oil for free, low prices.
Well, actually, shale started because, remember, it was expensive. It was not the cheap source of supply, and it's the development was spurred. It actually began for natural gas when North American natural gas prices were very high a decade ago or 15 years ago. It provided a financial incentive for, people have always known about shale. It's, as you mentioned earlier, it's the source rock. Shale has always been there, but the challenge was it's not a very productive geological formation. And so, the economics of it never worked. I was a member of an industry body that gave advice to the U.S. Energy Secretary in 2003. And the advice was, if you want to have a natural gas market in the United States, you should go and import it because there's not enough gas in the United States. And that was, most of the U.S. oil and gas industry believed that. There was one guy in the corner, the technology guy, who kept saying, shale, gonna be big. And all of the oil and gas companies said, yeah, we know about shale. We've known about shale forever, but we can't make the economics work. Well, with high prices, it provided the incentive for people to experiment and to perfect the technology of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. But it's still a very expensive way to produce oil and gas compared to the conventional resources that you enjoy here in Kuwait, for example. So I don't think it's a conspiracy to produce cheap oil. It's an effort by smart business people to make money, and they can make money because they found ways to innovate on the technology to make a expensive resource less expensive. It's still expensive compared to what you produce here, but but in the general state of the oil and gas markets, it looks like they finally figured out how to do that. And this isn't the first time this has happened. I mean, I'm pretty confident that the first person who thought to put oil on a ship here, in the Arabian Gulf and descend into the markets in Europe and North America, people thought they were crazy. Why would you put oil on a ship? And then think of all the frontiers that have been developed in the last 50 years, producing offshore, deeper waters, unconventional heavy oil deposits in Venezuela or Canada, producing in north of the Arctic Circle in Alaska. All of these are hard things to do, but people figured out how to do them because they could make money at it.
Thank you, Mark, for your presentation. It's very, always outstanding. This kind of quote, every year the statistics is always, we look at it as a reference for us in the industry. Anyway, my name is Isam al-Marzouk. I'm an ex-director in the oil sector in Kuwait. I'm retired and now joining the private sector. Anyway, the reason I have two questions to you, Mark, to ask. One of them is more of, probably I don't know whether you touched on it, I came later to this one, but basically, how do you, as BP, read the refining industry all over the world? That's the first question. The other one is more of political question. Is again, I want to know how BP look at the Middle East area in terms of unrest being whether Iraq, Iran, now Yemen, Egypt, Syria. Just want to see how do you read this kind of political and impact on the oil prices.
Okay. For refining, we have slides that will deal with both of your questions in the main Outlook document that we have, and we have copies of it here. So for refining, we believe that refining is a pretty tough industry to be in. Globally, barriers to entry are low. Today, there's something like 8 million barrels a day more spare capacity in the system than there was at the end of the last refining cycle in 2005. Much of the growth of liquid supply in our outlook is stuff that doesn't need to go through a refinery. Biofuels, natural gas liquids. So you actually don't have a lot of growth of conventional oil that needs to get refined. You have a lot of spare capacity in the system. You have people building new refineries, including in this region, India and China. So to us, this looks like a recipe for a pretty miserable 20 years for the world's commercial refiners. And the next question was about supply disruptions. And actually, we built a database this year that shows the history of supply disruptions. And we show that the disruptions that we're seeing in the last couple of years, Libya, like you said, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, if we count Iran's sanctions in there too, these are the second biggest supply disruptions that the world has ever seen. The only time we ever saw bigger supply disruptions was in the early 1990s when Iraq invaded and when the Soviet Union fell apart at the same time. So these are really big supply disruptions. And the question is, what do you do with that? The way we build a forecast, usually we forecast every country in the world and we try to be skeptical about official plans. And then we develop a forecast, and then we have a line at the bottom that said, minus random supply disruptions. We don't know where they'll be, but we put a line down there. You can't use the historical average because recent disruptions have been many multiples of the historical averages. And that when we talk to political experts around the world, they say that the political unrest that we're seeing, across the North Africa and Middle East region is likely to be durable. Now, the answer is who knows? That's not my area of expertise. But in our outlook, we show that we actually increased the amount and the time of this duration of elevated level of supply disruptions for this edition of our outlook. We also recognize that more broadly geopolitics matters for the energy outlook. And so we have a section in the uncertainties portion of our outlook that looks at some historical reference points of countries making strategic decisions about energy in the face of perceptions of geopolitical risk. You have an example of France after the oil price shocks of the 70s saying, we'll do nuclear power. In a different context, in the 1990s, you had China wrestling with, do we insist on staying self-sufficient in oil, or do we become a net importer? And it was a big strategic choice made in the 1990s to say, let's go ahead and import oil, we'll live with the risk of being import dependent, but let's grow our economy. So we know that strategic choices matter. We also know that people think that the world is becoming riskier right now. So, we feel like we have to watch and see what kind of strategic choices countries might make in the face of these perceptions of heightened risk.
Another one, just to add on the same question. Do you, as BB, believe that somehow, all of a sudden, in one time, there will be interruption of 5 million barrels a day cut from the Middle East? Do you have in your way? You know what I mean? Because closing up the Strait of Hormuz or even...
That's such dramatic.
Everyone's,
is this now more likely, less likely?
Well,
5 years ago, it's more likely.
I would like people in this room to tell me that. It certainly looks like the world has become riskier, but how you can't predict something that's unpredictable.
Yes.
And so I think what we have to do is talk to smart people and keep our eyes open and try to be prepared. But but it's not the role of a company like ours to hold strategic stocks, for example. We'll do it if we think we can. There's a market for it, and we can benefit our customers and our shareholders by doing it. But governments, whether it's the United States and the other members of the International Energy Agency holding strategic stocks, or countries in this part of the world holding spare capacity, developing flexibility in their pipeline and export systems to handle, to mitigate risks. These are all, I think, parts of the answer, but a big part of it are either, government and policy questions rather than company questions. The best we can do is talk to you and understand, what's going on.
Thank you.
I have a question, but maybe I'll start with a comment first. The comment has to do with terminology. When will BP start using more accurate terminology to describe the world? You divide the world between consumers and producers. We're all consumers. None of us are producers. Nature produces oil. We're extractors. Some countries extract more than they consume, they're net exporters. Some countries extract less, and they're net importers. So the correct thing would be exporter and importer, if I go that way. That's one. Again, when you say production, you're an economist. No. Production means capital, labor, land, etc., and you produce something that's continuous. The revenue from production is income. Revenue from extraction is capital. And that makes all the difference if we educate these people as to the correct economic terminology. So I was hoping I'd get you to participate in this campaign. Back to the question. Of course, the institutional factors that play a big role. We showed oil dropping in terms of role in terms of power production. I don't know how many people remember that EU since 1974 has prohibited building a plant that uses oil. repeat out the question. So that is going to be playing a bigger role, the institutional factor, as we're going along. Now, oil, as you mentioned, is becoming more expensive, coming from more expensive sources. Then our friend Ed Morse at Citicorp says oil price might go down to $9. Is that something like Marty Edelman's $1 barrel thing? Could you comment on that, please?
There's certainly a role for us as economists to be rigorous and precise in our language. So I take your point on board. Frankly, most days I'm happy if I can distinguish between production, consumption versus supply and demand. But we also do have to work to communicate our work to people who don't live in our profession. And so part of it is stylized, but it's a fair point. And then you talked about the importance of policy making, for example, in banning oil power generation in Europe, and that's certainly true. In the U.S., we had the Fuel Use Act in the 1970s, I think it was, that said natural gas is far too important to be used in power generation. It needs to be saved for value-adding, important uses like heating your home and being used in industry. So there's clearly policy can affect fuel mix and fuel choices. And then, I'm sorry, the last bit of your question was?
Ed Morse.
Yes, Ed Morse. Who am I to second guess Ed Morse? He's one of the towering figures of analyzing and knowing energy markets and policy of our time. Let's be honest. If any of us really knew the future, would be sitting here, or would Ed be sitting in his office in Citibank in New York, and would be laying on a beach somewhere, retired, with all the money in the world? The future is uncertain, right? You could characterize our industry as a constant battle between depletion and innovation. You always produce, if you know what you're doing, you always produce the easiest resource first, and then it gets more expensive. But at the same time, human ingenuity is finding ways to innovate. And so, I think to a significant degree, the history of our industry is that war between depletion and innovation. And there are times when depletion has the upper hand and the prices go up, and there's time when innovation has the upper hand and the prices go down. Ed clearly thinks that, I won't speak for Ed. It would seem on the surface of it that he thinks the innovation has the upper hand for now. Certainly could be true. Well, I'm sympathetic to the argument. Let me give you an anecdote from our own statistical review. We started tracking proved reserves of oil and gas in 1980. Since we started tracking that in 1980, the world has actually produced more oil than it had. And not only has the world not run out, proved reserves have actually doubled, more than doubled since then. So, over long time periods, the depletion argument, doesn't hold up. So I'm sympathetic to the argument. And we have to acknowledge that the price of oil that we saw in the last 3.5 years before prices began to fall was the highest oil price in the history of our industry, even if you adjust for inflation. And so, that was unusual times.
Well, that's geopolitics. Every time Bush opened his mouth, we're going to attack Iran, the price will jump $10 because of the enormous bottleneck, backing up 20 million barrels a day. It's just a nightmare. So people speculated. That's gone away. So we're in more normal times right now. There's no way the United States will attack Iran.
I wouldn't comment and wouldn't know, and so we'll have to.
They got to cooperate to bring the Central Asian oil and gas to the Gulf instead of having it go via China or Russia to the markets. This is the way to go. They're very solid partners based on oil and gas. Anyway, that's why.
Any more questions?
No more.
One more.
Mark, just Mark, in the belief of DB, when do they think that price is going to go back to? Or it's not going to go to that level?
Well, we of course have a price forecast that sits behind this outlook because you need a price outlook, a forecast to make things work. I hope you can appreciate, and I can assure you my lawyers are very clear that they appreciate that I shouldn't share that forecast externally. So what we've said is we believe the oil market is significantly oversupplied. It's likely to remain so for, we can see it remaining so for an extended period. But on our data, we believe that eventually the growth of tight oil will moderate, OPEC will recover market share, and the market will rebalance. So, that's kind of a directional hint without giving a specific answer. So, how's that for a non-answer answer?
Mike, can I ask one more question? Recently, yesterday or day before yesterday, you announced, or BP announced, they're going to invest about $10 to $12 million in Egypt. Oil and gas? And where? In Egypt.
I don't know the answer to that. No, do you know?
Yes, it's oil and gas in West Nile Delta. It's a combination of appraise and exploration. And BP has been quite committed to Egypt. We've been there for more than 30 years.
Another secret question.
Not a secret question.
It's not secret, it's actually...
Another one. This is regarding your negotiation with Abu Dhabi. Total paid upfront $2 billion. But this is not. This is the newspaper. And now that they are claiming that it is BP stake and Exxon stake. Any comments?
Say that
For
again,
the-
Bukhari.
Huh?
What was the statement?
The statement was that, to get the 9% share in Abu Dhabi, in the oil fields, Total already paid $2 billion
So, yeah,
bonus.
they declared it, they've had a press release on it.
Thank you.
And the remaining is Abu Dhabi's decision.
BP and ExxonMobil.
ExxonMobil actually withdrew.
Yeah.
ExxonMobil did not compete for this concession. It's
So it is
BP,
BP.
Shell, they have the Koreans, the Chinese,
BP.
the Russians. It's Abu Dhabi decision.
Thank you. Mike, thank you very much.
It's a weight game.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you for choosing Kuwait Economic Society. It was an outstanding presentation, and hope to see you soon, and not that much, 10 years again.
Mohan, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you all for your great questions.
Thank you.